start. Okay.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for another new day that we can gather together, and thank you for slightly milder weather. And we just ask, Father, that you would draw our hearts to you. Give us clear minds. Help us to consider your word and to understand it, and just to grow in our awe of who you are. And we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Yeah, speaking of awe, I saw that I got Darwin's Black Box, if you've ever heard of that book. I've heard of it for years, but never looked at it. And so I got it to the library. And I'm expecting it to be this kind of scientific, I'm going to have to kind of force myself through it. The guy is funny.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, the way he writes. He really has a sense of humor. But, yeah. But he was talking about the way the eye sees the actual processes that are going on, that a photon of light will hit, something, and then all this chemical reaction, and it happens in nanoseconds. Things are getting changed in shape, and enzymes are coming in, and all this. And, I don't know, it was about 10 steps or more, who knows, and I couldn't even pronounce the words. I couldn't even, usually I can give them kind of a try. Not these. And I thought, and that's just the human eye, one mechanism in the human body, and it all has to work or it doesn't work at all, and I thought of that, the depths of the wisdom and of God, and I thought, wow. But anyway, so the book was a surprise to me. I didn't expect to be laughing as I was reading through it, But anyway. Okay, we haven't really talked too much about this book because the first 3 chapters go along so much with Genesis that we pretty much covered it. So I haven't really gone through this book, but we're going to kind of diverge a little bit because obviously this book covers the whole Bible, or at least the whole story of Christ, and so it's going to pull ahead of us. But anyway, I did want to go through some of the things. Did you have any questions from the book as you were going through it? We are going to go through a little bit, so maybe that'll prompt your mind if you did have some. Okay, so starting with the first paragraph on today's lecture. One of the main ideas that was presented in the first 3 chapters of our textbook is that God is the creator, owner of the universe and everything in it, including us. We think of him as creator, but we don't always think of owner. If you make it, it's yours, And so he has the right then to decide how things go and how things work and how to run it. He's the boss. But ever since Adam and Eve first disobeyed God, they and all their descendants, like us here in this room, have resisted that idea. We want to be our own boss. We want to make our own decisions about our lives. And even if we start off with a positive attitude in our personal spiritual journey, there will come a time when what we want for our life is not the same as what God wants for us. And then we have a decision to make. Will I do what God wants, or will I insist on my own way? And I know that's been true in my own journey. I think some of you know my journey started about when I was 12. My parents were very religious people, and we would go out and camp out in our backyard and look up at the stars, and they would talk about God. They weren't believers at that time, but they were very religious and devout, if you will. And so when I was 12, it became important to me to know, how do you know it's true? How do you know there's a God? It wasn't that I was resisting it, I just wanted to know how. And they would try to tell me stuff and never made any sense. And, so I just started praying, God, if you're really there, would you show me? So I did that for a few months, and he did. I can't really describe it. It wasn't like I had a vision or anything, but just one night I had a friend over, and she and I were talking about things, and she said she wanted to be a missionary. And I said, well, why don't you start with me? And she just said, Edie, I know there's a God. And at that instant, I became aware of God's presence in that room. Like I said, it wasn't like I had a vision. It wasn't like I saw a bright light or anything like that. I just knew he was there. And I have no idea what she said after that, because I was just lost in this reality. He's here and he's heard me, you know. And so I was so excited. You know, it was like the honeymoon. The next day, the sky was bluer, everything, the grass was greener. And
do you ever still question?
I have never, ever questioned that he exists.
Right.
But I have questioned whether he's right. And that happened just a few months later when I wanted something, and I just sensed God's Spirit saying, this is not for you. There's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
This is not for you. Look, everybody, you know, all the stuff you say, I'm 13 or 14 and I know how this thing works.
Right.
You know. And this is not for you. And that made me mad. And I finally got to the point where I shook my 15-year-old fist in his face and said, you get out of my life. I don't want you. I don't care if you're real. I don't want you. I have my own decisions, thank you very much. And then I lived in terror for about 2 or 3 years, because I knew you can't talk to God like that and get away with it. And I knew if I died, I was going to hell. So I was actually even afraid to fall out of bed. I was afraid I would die on the way to the floor and my soul would just keep on going. Yeah, really. I mean, it was that real of a fear. So no, I never questioned whether he existed. But I didn't like the fact he was trying to tell me what to do until I was 17. And in the summer between my junior and senior years in high school, my family moved to a new town, and being churchgoers, Mom and Dad looked for a new church, and wouldn't you know, God in His providence, the closest church was a little Baptist church, just about half a block from our house, maybe 2 blocks, I don't remember. So it was pretty close. That was close, so we went there first, and Mom picked up a sample of every tract in their tract rack. She thought, I want to see what this church is all about. And she put them in the pocket of, she had a big purse with a big pocket. And the one right on top says, what does it mean to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ? I thought, because that first Sunday, we really were impressed with the preaching and everything, so our whole family went forward to join the church. And so the pastor and deacons took us back to talk to us, and they kept asking this thing, are you saved? And I thought, saved? What's that? I thought, maybe that's the Baptist way of saying you believe in God, and I believed in God. I've been fighting with him for years, you know. Right. So I managed to convince them I was saved, and I was scheduled to be baptized the following Sunday. But that whole week I kept thinking, saved must be kind of important, because they kept talking about it, you know. So anyhow, I spotted that tract. What does it mean to believe? That sounds a little bit like that question. So I took it out and took it upstairs to my room and read it through, understood, and accepted Christ right there in my bedroom. I have never met the woman that led me to the Lord, because she's the woman that wrote the tract, and I think she's probably with the Lord, you know, long since. But I accepted it just in time to be baptized the next morning at church. But anyway, yeah, there always comes a time, you know, when we find that what God wants and what we want, you know, there's a clash and we have to decide.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, we've all been there.
I have a question I've had for years.
Yes.
When they start going, like they go out of the garden and everything, and then their kids takes wives and all the things, where do they come from?
The wives?
Yeah. Adam and Eve were the first people, and they...
Exactly. It's a good question, and the answer is it has to be their own brothers and sisters. Because at that time, the prohibition against marrying within your family did not come for several hundred years. And at this time, that's all there were. And even in later times, like Abraham married his half-sister, you know?
But didn't they say they went like to other villages or something to that effect?
To get
Well,
the wives?
Yeah.
they may have, but Abraham didn't. She was right. Like I said, it was his own half sister.
But
And-
Adam and Eve were the first people, and then it says that they had.
Other sons and daughters in chapter 5. You haven't read that yet, maybe.
Okay.
But in the very next chapter, in fact, we will refer to that. But that is a good question, you know. But that's the only answer there can be if God just made Adam and Eve. And it says Eve is the mother of all the living. She's the matriarch of the entire human race.
I have a question.
Yes.
Too about. Are we meant to be vegetarian?
No.
Because I was like, no, wait a minute. He says,
Yeah, and
that
that's
we're supposed
also
to rule over the beasts and the fish, but doesn't say anything about eating them.
right.
They were
Exactly.
there. They were, but doesn't he say they were put there for us?
They were put there for us, but they ate, but God said all the green plants and everything are food for them. So even apparently at that time, even things that we think of as prey or hunter animals like lions and all, apparently they ate vegetarian also. But later on, that's a good question because a lot of people.
After sin is when it, like they started eating other animals, like the animals ate other
Well,
animals.
actually, I think they probably didn't eat them so much then because they would have been so used to the fruit. But at any rate, we know for sure that we can eat meat now because Jesus said, well, there's some place where he was actually eating the meat and blessing it,
Sounds like we've been doing that the wrong way. Is that another human error?
No,
Like we're not supposed to be eating
it's just that
steak?
something happened that changed a lot
Okay.
of things, and
Yeah.
they wouldn't have needed meat because they could get their protein other ways,
Okay.
But it is not a sin to have a good steak or a piece of bacon, So, phew! Isn't that good?
Okay.
But good questions, because some people do base their vegetarianism
On that.
on that,
Okay. Yeah.
and so we want to make sure we're rightly dividing.
But I kind of took it as when they left when they were cast out of the garden and everything was sin, because they had sinned against God, that things all changed.
Well, certainly some
The
things
soil
change.
changed,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It wasn't perfect anymore.
right. And that may have been the point at which the animals changed,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't, we weren't really ever specifically told that, but we do know that things did change. And they're going to change again once we come to the flood. But, yeah. So anyway, so we have this conflict between what God says and what we want to do, and we have to deal with it. And then actually the book, chapter 4, takes it back even before the garden. It started actually with Satan himself, who was originally named Lucifer, the morning star. And you think about that, who else is the morning star? Do you remember?
Lucifer, the angel.
Lucifer the angel, but who else is called the morning star? Who called himself that?
Can't remember.
At the end of Revelation, Jesus is talking and he says, I am the bright and morning star. So Lucifer had a name that sounded like the Son of God, and he was very beautiful. I thought it was interesting. It says, you were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone adorned you. It just seems like jewels are everywhere in heaven, and even on some of the angels, apparently. But unfortunately, he got puffed up with pride. I have the same name. I'm beautiful. I'm over the rest of you guys. I'm going to be like God. In fact, I'm going to be God. I'm going to take over this place, And so he said, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the angels. And I will sit on that throne, I'm going to make myself like the Most High. And what did he tempt Eve with? When you eat the fruit, you will be like God. That's what I wanted, and I want you to want that too. You know, it's sort of like, I thought to myself this time going through it, you know, we were told that when God created Adam and Eve, he made them in his image. He made them like himself in some way. Sort of like Satan's trying to do that too. I'm going to make you like me, you know. And I think that's why God hates pride so much. It just leads us into so much trouble. I'm sorry, I'm at the beginning of chapter 4 in the book. So now I'm on the second page of chapter 4, where it lists all those I wills, I will, I will, I will. And then down the next little block where it says these 6 things the Lord hates, and the first one on the list is a proud look, because it just leads to all the other things, that pride of life. And yeah. So anyway, so it started with Lucifer, started with the devil, but then it spread to us, and then it spread to all of our descendants since. But and then I liked what it said. Let's see, over a couple of pages at the top, it's on the page that faces Has God Said. It's over here, where it talks about just as God's names describe his attributes, like Elohim is the all-powerful one, and Yahweh or Lord is that covenant name that shows his relationship with man. Satan's names also reveal his character. The word Satan actually means adversary or enemy. So when you talk about Satan, you're talking about he's the enemy. And devil means false accuser or slanderer. And he loves to do that too. Spread lies. That's what he was doing to God. As God said, he's holding out on you. You know. So he was just doing what his name implies that he does. You know. So we have Satan entering, and then as we see what he did in this Has God Said, he was deceiving Eve, he fooled her, he told her lies, tricked her. He caused doubt to arise in her mind about God's goodness, and that's what he tries to do in our lives too. So that was my thing. I know what's good for me. Why are you saying I can't have this? You know? Denial. You won't die. He's calling God a liar. You know? So anyway, he just does all these things. And then I thought if you flip over to another page where it says disobedience at the top, that Bible verse down the third little paragraph, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. He's just looking, who's the next one I can take down, you know? And you think about, what did God tell Cain when he was mad? He said, sin's crouching at the door and it wants to have you, but you've got to control it. And I thought, that sounds like Satan. You know, he's just there, just waiting to get his foot in and get it. And unfortunately he did. He got it. And then we come to that bridge. I told you last week, remember that bridge thing? There was a bridge of friendship between Adam and Eve. They could come into his presence at any time freely, and there was this wonderful fellowship. Now they have sinned, and that bridge is gone. Now there's a big chasm. Now in the book, it looks kind of small. You know, it looks like you could take a running jump maybe and get over there. Think more of the Grand Canyon. It's really deep, and it's really far over there. You ain't going to jump it. You know? So, yeah, there's a gap, and something has to bridge it, but and people have tried different things. And the first thing they tried was to fix up their outward appearance. They wore the fig leaf, you know, just trying to cover themselves up. But unfortunately, that didn't cover the real problem, as we know, which was sin. So again, you have this little picture, and it looks like it almost makes it. But again, you really should picture man as being like a little speck of dust there, and his little bridge isn't gonna, do nothing. You know, that's not enough. So we'll have to wait and see what God's bridge is, because he does have one. But man tries different things, and the first one was fix up the outside. You know, got that fixed up, then you're probably okay. Nope. So, okay. And then we talked yet last week about the questions, where are you? That it wasn't because God didn't know, but because he wanted man to respond and to act and to come near him. And God is always working to try to restore the relationship. And so where are you and what have you done? And as we saw last week, they were just always trying to shift the other guy. Not my fault, it's hers. Not my fault, that's snakes, you know. And I liked the way they put what they said and what they should have said in that box. Adam said, the woman you put here, she gave me some and I ate it. And what he should have said, I blew it. I failed you miserably. I knew I shouldn't have. I did it anyway. Will you please forgive me? Show me how, show me what I need to do. And the woman said, the serpent. And she should have said, I know, I sinned. I shouldn't have done it. I knew better. Please tell me how you can restore. So you think of yourself as a victim. I can't help myself,
Right.
And you blame everybody else.
It's the world today.
That's just us today, yeah. And what God wants us to do is become responsible for our own actions.
That's what everybody needs to do.
That's what everybody needs to do, and to find his way of being restored. So, and God asks questions to help man rethink what the situation is. So, and we'll see him do that with Cain as well, when we get into that today. Okay, so we have the promise then of this coming offspring that's going to be the Redeemer. And so Eve is probably hoping that each baby boy is the one, And then we see the curse, all these bad things that happen, the biggest one of which is death, point 4 in the thing. And they talked about the different kinds of death. The physical death of the body, a separation of man's spirit from the body. Death of a relationship, a separation of his spirit from God. You no longer have that close thing. And then the second death, they call it death to a future joy. It's separation of man's spirit from God forever when you pass the point of no return. So you see what this book is doing. It's building up man's problem, so that when you have people in your life that know a little bit about God and they have questions, they can begin to understand just how big the problem is and where it came from. So it's building up the need for a Savior, So that's the point of the book here. And and then they get back to the drawing. So, are there any other questions that you had as you went through this part of the book? Okay, so let's go to Genesis then, because we had, I forgot I was going to show you something. He had this illustration about sin and just how repugnant it is to God. Do you remember? He said it was just like a dead rat.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Yeah, and how, we think, and we hate them when they're alive, but let alone when they're rotting, And so I thought that was kind of a good illustration, but I'll cover him up.
Yeah,
Now. Okay. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. So we can turn there on page 20 in your journals, and I'll read 1 and 2. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And I'm sure she was hoping, this is the one, this is the one. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Okay, so let's stop there and just talk about that. This sounds very hopeful. They're looking for this wonderful descendant that's going to be, the Redeemer. And so it starts off on a positive note. Adam and Eve are following God's mandate for them to be fruitful and multiply. They have 2 sons who grow up and become productive workers. One's a farmer, the other's a shepherd, both of which are honorable professions that follow the instructions God had given their father. Remember when he first created Adam, he said, I want you to rule over the animals and take care of them? So that's one son, that's what he did. And then work the ground, So the other son was a farmer. So they're both doing the 2 sides of that mandate. So far, so good. And then I have a note here. Adam and Eve did actually have a number of other children, as recorded in Genesis 5:4. You can just flip over there. It says the days of Adam after he fathered Seth, their 3rd son, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. They're not named or mentioned because they don't play a part in this overall narrative.
Who was 800 years?
Adam.
Oh, okay.
So, and we'll get to that when we come to that chapter. So, okay. But we quickly learn that there was a much greater difference between these 2 brothers in their choice of occupation. One of them became a God follower, choosing to do things God's way. The other one became a God rejecter, insisting on his own way, and in so doing, he started a trend that has continued to this day with disastrous results. And Edie can say, yep, I know, been there, done that. In fact, Jesus' half-brother Jude mentioned Cain in his little book. That's the one that comes just before Revelation. It's just 1 chapter long. And Jude, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, Jesus' brothers did not believe in him until after the resurrection. They were thinking that he was crazy. He's crazy. And they came to even try to take charge of him because he was nuts and he's going to cause trouble for the whole family, But then his one brother became a leader in the local church, James, and Jude wrote one of his books. And he was so excited about salvation that that's what he wanted to write about. But he saw problems in the church. And there were people in the church that were false teachers. He said he originally wanted to write to his hearers about salvation, but he felt compelled to write to them instead about certain false teachers who have crept in unnoticed, he says in verse 4. And they walk in the way of Cain. They follow his example. In other words, these people follow his example of rejecting God's commands and who are dangerously hostile to the people of God. So, that's the 2 sons. So now let's go on to verses 3 through 5. So let me read those. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. Okay, so again, sounds pretty positive. They both are following the professions that God had told them to do, and now they're bringing offerings. And we are told that there's a problem, though. We're told that God had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Now, when we read that in English, it sounds pretty cold. It's like, I have no respect for you. But the Hebrew meaning, or the word that's translated regard here, it means inspecting something and giving it careful attention. Seeing if it's okay or not. So that's what he was doing. And when God inspected Abel's offering, he saw that it matched what he had apparently told Adam and his family about the kind of offerings that were acceptable. And when he inspected Abel himself, it says, Abel and his offering. When he inspected Abel himself, he saw a man whose heart was set on doing things the right way. But when he inspected Cain and his offering, he saw Cain had not brought the right kind of sacrifice, and his heart wasn't right either. And that becomes apparent in the way he responds to what God says. So this raises the questions. How do we know?
That's what I was going to say. How do we know that?
Great.
How do we know?
And that's another good question. So how do we know? Because we are not told in Genesis.
Yeah.
So we have to do some analogy or some thinking about what we're told elsewhere. When God did start actually giving laws, remember the Passover lamb?
Mm-hmm.
And they'd been offering animals, and he was very specific. And Christ himself is called the Passover lamb.
Mm-hmm.
So all through the Old Testament, when God does talk about offerings, he talks about offering animals, specifically bringing their blood. Because it is the blood of Christ shed that actually covers our sin and takes it away. And so when did they know that? Well, let's think about something else that we know did happen in Genesis. Well, let me just go back to my notes here. What kind of sacrifices are acceptable to God? We're not told in this passage, but we know from what other scriptures tell us that what Abel offered sounds very much like the Passover lamb. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, God required a spotless animal to be slain, and the writer of Hebrews tells us, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. We do know that God killed at least one animal when he made those garments of skins for Adam and Eve. And I suspect it was at that time. Here they were supposed to take care of all these animals. And God had to kill an innocent animal to get its skin to make leather garments. And I'm sure he was explained to them, this is a picture, you know. And it was more than just a way of providing clothing. So the problem was Cain brought the wrong kind of sacrifice.
Okay.
Fruit and vegetables don't bleed, you know. He was offering the fruit of his own efforts. Look at this gorgeous, big, you know, whatever. Yeah, you know, not blood shed by a substitutionary animal. And remember, earthly sacrifices were always intended to represent heavenly truth. When all the people obediently offered all those lambs over all those years, they still had sin. Christ still had to come to actually be the sacrifice. It was just a reminder that blood has to be shed, that God requires blood. And so all those sacrifices are a picture. So when Cain brought, the truth was that sin could only be atoned for by the shed blood of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus Christ. Cain's sacrifice distorted the truth, and that was not acceptable. That's what Satan's all about anyway, and that's what he got him to do. Just twist it a little bit. This is nice. This is wonderful. Why wouldn't God be happy with this? You know, it's good enough. Nope. You ruined my picture, and you're telling a lie in what you're doing. Okay, so we're in trouble again. So now we come to verses 6 and 7. So let's read those. Whoops, I'm in the wrong chapter. Okay. So I'll start back at verse 5. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard, so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, won't you be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin's crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." So, once again, notice God's heart toward Cain. He acknowledges his anger. He doesn't just pretend, you know, he doesn't just say, "Oh, get over it." No. He asks him, "Why are you angry? Think about it, Cain. What's making you mad?" "Well, you're jealous because I accepted your brother's thing and not yours. And you're mad at, you know." He wants him to reconsider his actions and to do the right thing. And he also warns Cain, you know, that he's in danger of being consumed by his own sinful desires. It's crouching, just waiting, just like a wild beast lurking near its prey. So God cares about Cain, even though he's brought the wrong kind of offering. God cares about him and wants him to do right. So now we come to verses 8 to 16. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's Abel, your brother?" "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord says, "What have you done?" And now, he says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. You thought you could hide him, but I hear it, you know. And when you work the ground, it's no longer going to give you its strength, and you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain complains about that. He says, "My punishment's greater than I can bear. I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who found him should attack him. And then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. Okay, so God has just warned Cain, hey, sin's just trying to get you. You need to learn to control this. Get your anger under control, bud. But unfortunately, Cain ignores that warning, and he does the absolutely unthinkable. He kills his own brother in a jealous rage. And when God questions him about it, he lies. So now he comes under God's judgment. He buried Abel in the ground that he had once cultivated, so now the ground's not going to produce fruit for him. And not only that, but he's to be a fugitive and a wanderer. Well, if you're wandering around all the time, you're not going to be growing crops. That takes time, you know. Cain fears that somebody's going to kill him. Well, who's the somebodies that are out there? His own brothers. Why would he be afraid that his brother might kill him?
Revenge.
Well, revenge, but he killed his brother over nothing, in a sense. So, don't we do that? We tend to project onto other people the things that's in our own heart. And he's afraid of them because he's done the very thing that he's afraid now they're going to do to him. You know? Sort of like that that we're afraid that others will do unto us as we have done unto them, you know. But anyway, but God shows Cain grace even now. And he first mentions a concept it's another concept that's going to be clearly spelled out later in the Bible. Vengeance is mine. No, I don't want them to kill you. Your life is in my hands, and I will determine when you die. You know, vengeance is mine. And God's going to protect Cain. I don't know what that mark was, I have no idea. I don't think we're ever told, really, but he somehow, you know, marked him under God's protection, you know. So, will Cain feel gratitude to God for his promise of protection and choose to obey him from now on? Sadly, no. Instead of continuing to wander, he travels far enough that he thinks he's out of God's presence. Goes to the land of Nod, wherever that was, somewhere east of Eden. Then he settles down in one place, and we're even told later he builds a city and names it after his firstborn son. He's still got that defiant determination, I'm going to do my own thing, and you can't tell me what to do. Sad, sad, sad. Okay, so then we get to the end of chapter 4, and down in verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and again, that was his sister, and that time it was okay. And she conceived and bore Enoch. And when he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, again, this tells you something. Not only did Adam and Eve have other sons and daughters, their kids married and they had sons and daughters. It takes people to make a city, right? So apparently by this time, there's enough people that you can have at least a small city. It's kind of interesting. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other, Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, sort of like his grandpa, or maybe great-great-great-grandfather, whatever. His brother's name was Jubal. Kind of like that, Jabal and Jubal. Bangladeshis do that too. They like to give rhyming names to their kids, or names that are similar. He was the father of those who play the lyre and harp. He's a musician. And Zillah, the other wife, also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Oh my. What is this? So let's stop there for a moment. So these verses have listed 5 generations of descendants from Cain, with special attention given to the last one, Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-grandson. And I thought, well, actually, his not-so-great-grandson. So he's following in his great-great-great-granddaddy's path of doing his own thing. So how is that? Well, we see in verse 19 that first of all, he broke God's pattern of marriage, 1 man and 1 woman. By marrying 2 wives. Now, maybe others have done that, but this is the first time it's mentioned in Scripture. And it was interesting. I looked up their names, and Ada's name means ornament. So you kind of have the feeling he went for trophy wives. Right. I mean, we don't know. Right. But we know he's a scumbag. Yeah. Anyway, whether that's the case or not, he's still breaking the pattern set by God.
And this was Naamah?
Ada.
Oh.
I'm sorry, it's in your notes
Feel
here.
like I should be starting a family tree.
I know.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to give you a little
Who was the
thing to fill in.
grandson, though? Or the great-great-great-great?
Lamech. Lamech is the one
Oh,
that
okay.
married 2 wives. So,
Which was Ada and Zillah.
yeah, Ada and Zillah. Zillah's name means shade, and I thought, well, I don't know, that didn't tell me anything, but I just thought it was kind of interesting. But verses 23 and 24 reveal something even worse. He's a murderer, and he's bragging about it, like it's something really cool that he did. I mean, this young man hit him, so he shouldn't have. He struck him. But to kill him, in return, isn't that sort of over the top? He obviously didn't damage Lamech, or he wouldn't have been able to kill him. Anyway, and he brags that his revenge is going to be 11 times more effective than God's. Wow. How far away from God can you get? But we also learned something else, and this isn't a negative thing per se, it's an interesting thing. We learned he had 3 sons and a daughter by these 2 women, and we see something about how culture is developing. You have people learning how to work with metal. So I'm sure they made tools, they made weapons, they made all kinds of stuff. One was a shepherd, but not more than that, he was a nomad. He was sort of a wanderer, And then the other one was a musician. So this is just kind of interesting. The culture, even way back when, was developing and expanding. And then we come to the very end of the chapter, and again it ends on a note of hope. It says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. I'm sure she'd been hoping Abel was the one. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh, and at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So, like I said, this chapter ends on a note of hope. We have another son being born, and from what he said, she's apparently hoping that this child will be that promised offspring that will destroy Satan and deliver mankind from sin. We know that wasn't the case, but Seth is the ancestor of Christ. As we'll have some genealogies and we'll be able to trace it back to him. So the promised Redeemer is going to come through his line of descendants. Out of all those sons and daughters that Adam and Eve had, this is the one that's going to be the actual ancestor of Christ. And next week we will see a first few generations of Seth's line, so I'll give you a little chart that you can fill in that might be helpful. Keep track of those things. Okay, any other questions from this chapter? Okay, so that brings us to our what about evolution? And I wanted to start off, many of you asked a question last week, it was a good one about, how is it that people live such long lives way back when? And we aren't able to say definitively, but what we can talk about is the conditions on earth were favorable. God said that they were very good. So in this book on page 36 and 37, they have a 2-page spread that addresses the topic, what conditions would make a very good earth? And they mention 3 things. Let's see, I have it here. Yeah. Okay. These 3 conditions that we know are different from what they are today. And those conditions are a stronger magnetic field, a milder climate all over the world, and increased amounts of oxygen and CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. You think, how on earth can we know that? Well, let's see what they have to say. Okay, was Earth's magnetic field stronger? The magnetic field of the Earth is known to be weakening today. Scientists measure it, and they've found over time it has changed, and it's sort of at the same rate. Anyhow, it keeps changing, getting weaker. So, that demonstrates the fact that the magnetic field of our planet was once much stronger than it is now. Well, what benefits would that provide? So what if it was stronger? Well, it's thought that the magnetic field of our Earth is produced by a circulating current in the molten core of the planet. That's what's generating the electricity that's generating the magnetism. Like everything else in nature, this built-in magnet is deteriorating with time. Stars wear out. Things wear out. One of the critical benefits of Earth's magnetic field is the shielding effect provided in the Earth's upper atmosphere that cause harmful cosmic rays to bounce back. Some of them manage to get through, but that magnetic field repels a bunch of them. And if the magnetic field were stronger in the past, then the elimination of cosmic rays would have been maximized. Very little would have actually penetrated to come down and strike our bodies, okay? The health of all living creatures would be improved. Most notably, and this was interesting, I didn't know this, an optimum magnetic field would eliminate one cause of genetic mutations that lead to birth defects in babies. So the magnetic field would have been beneficial because it was stronger, repelling those cosmic rays. Okay, well, what about the climate? Extreme seasonal changes from summer to winter with marked variations in highs and low temperatures are a direct result of the axial tilt of the Earth. Whenever you see a globe, it's always kind of tilted at 23 degrees. And that's that way for a reason, because as the Earth goes around the sun, it's tilted. Well, what happens, if the clock is the sun, the South Pole's getting a little bit more heat than the North Pole is. But then as the Earth continues around, by half a year later, it's going to be oriented like that. So now this side is getting summer and this side is getting winter. But what if the axis wasn't tilted? What if it was straight up and down, vertical? Then you'd have equal amounts from top to bottom all year long. Okay? So just so you understand what we're talking about, we talk about axial tilt and all that. The Earth now has an axis tilted about 23 degrees in respect to its orbit around the Sun. If the Earth were nearly vertical, there'd be little or no seasonal temperature change, and the Arctic and tropical zones would be comparatively small. The temperate zones of Earth would be greatly expanded. What modern people seldom think about is the very real possibility and scientific evidence that the Earth once did have a milder climate from pole to pole. Nothing less than a cosmic-sized catastrophe would have been necessary to kick our planet into the tilt we have today. But that's another story. They said there's scientific evidence. Does evidence tell of a very different early Earth? Fossil impressions of palm fronds. Where do palms grow? In the tropics. Well, so you might find fossil impressions of them if they hadn't been found on northern Vancouver Island in Canada. And I also have read elsewhere, it's not in here, but they have found mammoths buried in ice, mammoth elephants with buttercups in their bellies in the polar regions. Well, obviously, when they were wandering around, it wasn't polar, you know? So they have found evidence of plants growing where they would never grow today. So it kind of leads you to believe there must have been a milder climate all over. Okay, so we have that stronger magnetic field repulsing more cosmic rays. We have a milder climate. And then we talk about the atmosphere. Whoops, I'm sorry, I jumped to the wrong page. Here we go. Okay. The effects of greater oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We realize that oxygen is a natural byproduct of plants on Earth. The world's massive coal beds of suddenly buried tropical forests demonstrate overwhelming evidence of ancient flooding. The world was once filled with greenery, maybe 4 times more than it is today, just based on the amounts that they're finding, you know. And with a generally more humid atmosphere, because we know that all that water was put up in that atmosphere, a 25% oxygen content would be very plausible in such a world. You have all more plants producing it, you know, getting it up there into the air. So that fact, more oxygen, coupled with a denser atmosphere, because it has more water vapor in it than it does today, increased oxygen would virtually eliminate disease. At least it would make for very, very healthy people. Longevity would be greatly affected. Aging could have been slowed to almost nothing. You know, endurance would be dramatically increased because you have more oxygen. So winded, you know. And growth would be maximized for the plants, you know. And then CO2. That's a small part of the atmosphere today, but it's vital for the health of the plant kingdom. With only a slight percentage point of increase, the plant world would be much more successful in keeping the planet looking like paradise. So all that to say, this is all speculation about what the early Earth really was, but it's speculation based on some evidence that we see. It makes it at least reasonable to think that that's the way it could have been. So we can't give a definitive reason why they lived that long, but we do know that conditions would have encouraged that. Okay, so now back to my notes, see what comes up next. Okay, so how old is the universe? And for this, turn to the very end of chapter 3 in your textbook, the Stranger book, where they had that little boxed article on what about evolution. Last week we talked about one topic from that, and today I want to pick up another one. So at the very, very end of chapter 3, yeah, we discovered the different books have different pages. So all I know is that if you turn to chapter 4 and then just turn back a page, you'll be at that box. Okay, so everybody with me? Yeah. Okay, what I want to pick up to talk about today is actually at the top of the second page of that article, where it talks about the Earth's age. You know, is it 6 to 10,000, or is it several billion years? What is it? It appears very old, but the Bible doesn't allow for eons of time. It is true that scientists have developed numerous astronomical, solar, terrestrial, and biological clock models in an effort to determine the age of the universe. And depending on the clock model used, ages for the Earth range from a few thousand years to billions. Well, to me, that's kind of a wide spread, you know? So, which clock is right? Well, I want to look at just one clock today. And, excuse me. It's radiometric. And I'm thinking, oh boy, we're getting back to science.
Not my forte.
Okay. So this is found on page 62 and 63. Are radiometric dating methods reliable? Okay, so before we jump into that, let's do just a little bit of science review. So you see that little drawing I have of an atom? It's actually a very simplified drawing. And, as you can see, each atom has a nucleus in the very center made up of protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which have no charge. And then each atom also has some negatively charged electrons whirling around it. They don't actually travel in neat little orbits like that. Modern textbooks have more of a cloud, you know, they can be anywhere. But I thought for our purpose, so we can talk about what's there and what happens, I wanted the simpler drawing. Okay, the identity of the element is determined by the number of protons it has. Actually, we'll have the same number of electrons, but I guess they chose the protons. So if you have just one proton and one electron, you've got the gas hydrogen. If you have 2 and 2, you have helium, and so on and so on. This is actually, I looked it up, this one must have 3 protons, so that would make it lithium, but oxygen has 8, and so on and so on. So you change the number of protons, you actually change the identity of the element. Changes completely what it is and how it works, you know, which I think is very interesting. Sort of like if you think of protons as beads, they're not, but think of them as beads. If you were able to whack one of the big elements that has like 200 protons in its nucleus and get all those protons rolling around, and you picked them up and put them together, they'd form different things depending on what, you know, even though they came out of this thing. I just think that's amazing. But anyway, that's just extra. Okay. So, the number of neutrons, however, that's the non-charged particles, they add weight, but they don't add any charge, and they don't affect the identity of the element, okay? So the number of neutrons in the nucleus may change without changing the identity. Over 99% of the hydrogen atoms in the universe, how they know this, I don't know, contain no neutrons. About 0.15% have 1 neutron in their nucleus. And these special ones weigh more than the other hydrogen atoms do, but chemically they're identical. So you could take 2 of those to form water, turning it to an oxygen, and the water would look just like normal water. It would just weigh a little bit more, okay? Now, so that's the structure. Okay, radioactive decay, what is that? If sometimes things happen to make the nucleus break apart, when it breaks apart, it gives off radiation of various kinds, and we call that radioactive decay because it's breaking down.
Down.
Mm-hmm. And so however many protons are left, that's what the new element will become, okay? So it started out one thing, and then it actually turns into something else because some of its protons have been knocked off, okay? So, that's the next thing, radioactive decay. Not all nuclei are stable. Heavier ones tend to break apart just on their own. They don't have to be bombarded in somebody's chamber, you know. They tend to break apart and lose protons, which means the original atom changes from what it was into something entirely different. And that new thing is called the daughter element. Whatever it ends up being is the daughter element. For example, radioactive uranium breaks down slowly and gradually to form the very stable element lead. Once you get to lead, that process stops. So a lot of radioactive things get down to lead eventually. Okay? This conversion of one type of nucleus into another in a spontaneous way, it happens all by itself, is known as radioactive decay. Okay, then we need one more term before we can get into the so what, aspect of it. Although all radioactive substances are unstable, some are more unstable than others. An atom of carbon-14 might last thousands of years before decaying, while an atom of bromine-80 would decay within minutes. The decay rate, how fast it does that, can be stated as its half-life. And why do they call it that? The half-life is the length of time it takes for half of the original substance to decay into the new substance. So, suppose you have a little 8-ounce jar of substance A on your shelf somewhere. We all have it, right? Which has a half-life of 10 days. After 10 days, if you looked in there, you'd only have 4 ounces left, and maybe a little bit of the daughter element, okay? After another 10 days, you'd only have 2 ounces left. And then another 10, you'd only have 1, and then pretty soon, got nothing much. Really? So, are the radiometric dating methods reliable? And we're going to look at this. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 tells us to test and prove, examine things, and see if they're true. So we don't just want to take statements at face value, even when they're made by scientists. With that in mind, we want to look at one of the methods used to date volcanic rocks, and that's the radiometric. So, okay, if you pick up a volcanic rock, that's the rock that's formed from the molten lava, gets hard after it cools down. Okay, is there some way to figure out when that rock cooled down? When was it molten and when did it cool down? Museums tell us they have highly technical ways to analyze the elements and determine how long ago these types of rocks were formed. These are the radiometric dating systems that have only been used in the last few decades, at least at the time of writing of this book. Many people have been indoctrinated to think that these are authoritative methods to establish absolute ages for rocks. But are they realistic? Well, some assumptions are made in this method. You always need to know the assumptions. What are people assuming are true? The first thing they're assuming that there was no daughter element present in the rock at the start. So, say everything goes to lead. Well, what if you found volcanic rock that had a lot of lead in it? They're saying, the people using this method said, well, there wasn't any lead to begin with. And so all this lead must have been the product of this radioactive decay, and so we can count back, But the question is, how did they know there was no lead? Lead does occur naturally in the earth. Anyway, that's their assumption, that there was no lead in this volcanic rock at the beginning. Okay. They're also assuming the decay rate has always been the same, that nothing has ever altered that, and that might be a reasonable assumption. But anyway, that is the assumption, because otherwise, if it changed, how would you know then how old this rock really was? Sometimes it was decaying faster than others, you know. And they're also assuming that there's no changes in mineral content from what they call leaching. Rock looks solid, but it has little microscopic pores in it, and water can eventually seep in there. And water dissolves about everything, so it may have brought in some other things. But they're assuming no leaching. Okay, I'll give them the decay rate. Maybe that's always been the same, but I really question, how can you know that there was no lead originally, and how do you know that there was never any leaching? So those are some questions to ask ourselves. Well then, let's look at some actual case histories, where they've actually taken real lava, tested it, come up with an answer. Okay, case history number 1. Volcanic lava rocks from Hawaii were subjected to potassium argon testing. Result, the age was between 160 million and 3 billion years. Again, I think, how big of a spread are you really allowing? But anyway, okay. Either way, it's old, That's how long ago this lava supposedly cooled down from a molten state and the clock was set, Upon further checking, it was discovered that the particular lava flow from which these rocks were taken erupted in 1801. That's a little different from 60 million or 100 and some billion. That's just a couple of hundred years, Okay, that's one case history. Tests were made on volcanic rocks from Russia, with results ranging from 50 million to 14.6 billion. Again, I don't like spreads like that, but anyhow. Historical research now determined these rocks actually erupted only a few thousand years ago. It's like knowing when Pompeii erupted, and you can date from it. Well, okay, the actual date. It doesn't begin to match up. So how can we really be assured that when you test other rocks that we're getting accurate results? You can't be. So that's just what, we just need to ask some questions. And we need to know, again and again, I will tell you, we are not nuts to believe the Bible. Okay? So next week we're going to go on to chapter 5 and chapter 5 in Genesis and chapter 5 in the textbooks.
Okay.
And see what we can find there.
Alright. Thank you, ma'am.
Yep.
Thank you.
And I'll try not to overwhelm you with science, but I know it's a stretch.
Been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah, but we need to refresh.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we need to be able to have answers, at least in our own minds.
Also, you need to have questions.
Yeah. That's true too.